He was a broken veteran scrapping metal in the desert just to survive. When he placed a bid on an old tank, everyone else ignored. But hidden inside that rusting war machine was a vault no one was supposed to find, containing $350 million in Cold War secrets that powerful men had buried decades ago and would kill to keep hidden. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The Nevada sun didn't just shine, it punished. It hammered down on the desert floor like a blacksmith working steel, turning everything beneath it into shimmering waves of heat that bent reality itself. In a run-down trailer park on the outskirts of Reno, where the American dream went to rust and fade, Marcus Webb sat on the concrete steps outside his single-wide mobile home, staring at the stack of medical bills in his hands. The numbers blurred together after a while, all those commas and zeros creating a mathematics of despair he'd never been taught to solve. Marcus was 32 years old, but his body told the story of someone much older. His left leg ached constantly, a souvenir from an IED outside Kandahar that had torn through his unit's convoy, like the hand of God reaching down to remind them they were mortal. The explosion had killed 3 of his brothers instantly, their laughter from that morning's breakfast still echoing in Marcus's ears even 5 years later. He'd survived, but sometimes in the dark hours before dawn, when the nightmares came and his sheets were soaked with sweat, he wondered if survival was actually a blessing or just a different kind of curse. The shrapnel had done more than damage his leg. It had carved a path across his ribs, punctured his right lung, and left a constellation of scars along his back that looked like a roadmap to hell. But the visible wounds, those were the easy ones. Those could be treated with surgery and physical therapy, and prescription painkillers that Marcus tried desperately not to rely on, because he'd seen too many guys go down that road and never come back. The invisible wounds, the ones that made him wake up screaming, the ones that made loud noises send him diving for cover, the ones that had cost him his marriage and nearly cost him his relationship with his daughter, those were the ones that never stopped bleeding. He ran his calloused hand through his short brown hair, feeling the scar tissue along his scalp, where shrapnel had kissed him and decided to let him live. His fingers trembled slightly, a constant reminder of the nerve damage that made fine motor work difficult some days. He was supposed to be taking medication for the tremors, but medication cost money, and money was something Marcus Webb didn't have much of anymore. The trailer park was quiet in the mid-morning heat. Most of his neighbors were at work, those lucky enough to have jobs that paid more than minimum wage, and didn't ask too many questions about gaps in employment or why someone might need frequent mental health days. Marcus had worked a dozen different jobs since coming home, each one ending the same way. Either he'd have a panic attack and quit, or his leg would give out and he'd be let go, or some combination of both would conspire to remind him that the world didn't have much use for broken soldiers once the parades were over and the flags were folded. Currently, he cobbled together income from 3 part-time gigs, stocking shelves at a grocery store overnight, when his insomnia was at its worst anyway, doing basic car repairs for neighbors who paid in cash, and occasionally helping out at Tommy's towing company when they needed an extra hand. Tommy was another veteran, Iraq War, and he understood without words why some days Marcus couldn't get out of bed, why certain sounds made him freeze, why trust was something that had to be earned slowly and carefully, like teaching a feral animal to eat from your hand. The medical bills in Marcus's hands totaled $47,000. Surgery for his leg 2 years ago, when the pain had become unbearable. Emergency room visits when panic attacks convinced him he was having a heart attack. Physical therapy that his inadequate insurance only partially covered. Medication for pain, anxiety, depression, sleep, all the chemical bandages, trying to hold together a man who'd been blown apart by high explosives and poorly reassembled by a Veterans Affairs system, overwhelmed and underfunded. He was 3 months behind on the lot rent for his trailer. The electricity had been shut off twice already this year. He drove a beat-up Ford pickup that burned oil and made concerning noises that he didn't have time or money to fix properly. And his daughter, 9-year-old Sophie, the one pure and perfect thing in his shattered life, was growing up splitting time between his trailer and her mother's new house with her new husband, who had a good job and steady income and didn't wake up screaming about burning vehicles and dying friends. Marcus set the bills aside and reached for his phone, checking the time. He had 4 hours before he needed to be at the grocery store for his overnight shift. 4 hours to figure out how to stretch $17 until his next paycheck. How to explain to Sophie why he couldn't afford to take her to the movies this weekend, like he'd promised. How to keep pretending that everything was fine when everything was very much not fine. The phone rang in his hand, startling him badly enough that he nearly dropped it. His heart rate spiked, adrenaline flooding his system before his conscious mind could catch up. Just a phone. Just a ring. Not incoming fire. Not an alarm. Just technology doing what technology does. He forced himself to breathe slowly, counting to 4 on the inhale, holding for 4, exhaling for 4. The breathing exercise the VA therapist had taught him before his insurance ran out, and he couldn't afford the sessions anymore. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. Normally he'd let it go to voicemail, assuming it was another debt collector with their rehearsed sympathy and veiled threats. But something made him answer. Maybe desperation, maybe curiosity, maybe just the need to hear another human voice in the oppressive silence of a Wednesday morning. "Yeah, this is Marcus," he said. Marcus Webb. The voice was male, older, with a southwestern drawl. The one who used to do maintenance work at Miller's garage. Used to, Marcus confirmed, trying to place the voice. "They laid me off about 6 months ago." "Right. Right. This is Gerald Hutchins. I used to bring my Chevy in for oil changes. We talked about your service a few times." Marcus had a vague memory of an older man, maybe 65. Always wore a bolo tie. Asked intelligent questions about vehicle maintenance. "Yeah, I remember. What can I do for you, Gerald?" "Well, I'm calling because I thought you might be interested in something. There's a military surplus auction happening this Saturday, out in the desert about 40 miles west of here. Government contractor liquidating old equipment. Vehicles, parts, tools, all kinds of stuff going for cheap, because they need to clear out a storage facility." Marcus felt a small spark of interest. The first thing approaching excitement he'd felt in weeks. What kind of vehicles? Little bit of everything. Humvees, trucks, even a couple of old tanks. Most of it's been sitting in the sun for decades, but you know how government stuff is built. Even the junk has good bones. Marcus's mind started calculating. If he could buy something cheap enough, strip it for parts, he might be able to make enough to catch up on rent, maybe even pay down some of the medical debt. His small repair business, really just a bay in a shared garage that he rented by the month, needed parts constantly. Buying retail was killing him. But getting them from a surplus auction, that could be the edge he needed. "How cheap are we talking?" he asked. "Last time I went to one of these, a guy bought a whole Humvee for $800. Needed work, but the engine was solid. Another guy got a pallet of spare parts for $200. These things are like estate sales for the military-industrial complex. Nobody wants to haul this stuff away, so it goes for pennies on the dollar. Marcus looked at his bank account on his phone. He had $923 in checking, money he'd been saving for Sophie's birthday next month. It was supposed to go toward a bike she'd been asking for. Maybe dinner at the pizza place she loved. But if he could turn that money into $2,000 or $5,000, or even more by stripping and reselling parts, he could buy her 2 bikes, take her to dinner every week for a month. The rational part of his brain, the part that wasn't desperate and drowning, warned him that this was a gamble, that he could spend his last savings on junk that wouldn't pan out, leaving him even worse off than he was now. But desperation has a way of silencing rationality, of making risk feel like the only logical option when all the safe choices have already failed. "Where exactly is this auction?" Marcus asked. Gerald gave him directions to a location so remote it didn't have a street address, just GPS coordinates and landmarks. An old airfield that had been decommissioned in the 90s, now used for storage by contractors who cleaned up after the military moved on to newer, shinier bases. Starts at 8 in the morning. Cash only. Bring a trailer if you can, or at least know somebody who can haul what you buy. These folks don't deliver. I appreciate the heads up, Gerald. Just thought you could use the opportunity. You're a good kid, Marcus. Good mechanic, too. Hope things turn around for you. After he hung up, Marcus sat on the steps for a long time, watching the heat waves rise from the asphalt, thinking, this could be it. This could be the break he needed. Or it could be the final mistake that pushed him from struggling to completely broken. He called Tommy. "Tell me about this military auction," Marcus said when his friend answered. "Oh, hell. You heard about that?" Tommy laughed. "I was actually thinking about going myself." "Why? You interested? Maybe. You think it's legit?" "Yeah. These contractors do them a few times a year. Government pays them to clear out old storage facilities, and they recoup some costs by auctioning off anything that's not classified or dangerous. It's all legal, all above board, just stuff that's too old or too expensive to maintain. Better to sell it cheap than pay to dispose of it." "You going?" Marcus asked. Was thinking about it. Could use some spare parts for the wreckers. Want to ride out together. Marcus felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. Going with Tommy meant he wasn't alone in this gamble, meant he'd have backup if something went wrong, meant he'd have someone to tell him if he was about to make a stupid decision. "Yeah," Marcus said. "Let's do it." Saturday morning arrived with the kind of heat that made you question why humans had ever decided to live in the desert. Marcus was up at 5, had already done his physical therapy exercises that he could no longer afford to do with a therapist, had already taken his morning medications with the last of his coffee, had already checked on Sophie, who was spending the weekend with her mother. He'd told his ex-wife about the auction, tried to explain why he was spending their daughter's birthday money on what amounted to a gamble. She'd gotten that look. The one that said she was disappointed but not surprised. The one that reminded him of all the reasons their marriage had fallen apart. "Just don't come crying to me when it doesn't work out," she'd said. Sophie needs stability, Marcus, not grand gestures that fall apart. He'd wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself, wanted to explain that he was doing this for Sophie, that he was trying to build something stable for her. But arguing with his ex-wife never went anywhere productive. So he'd just nodded and promised to pick Sophie up on Sunday like usual. Tommy pulled up at 5:30 in his flatbed tow truck. A massive diesel beast that could haul pretty much anything. He had coffee and breakfast burritos. which immediately elevated him to sainthood in Marcus's estimation. "You ready for this?" Tommy asked, as Marcus climbed into the passenger seat, his leg protesting the height, even with the running board. "No," Marcus admitted, "but I'm doing it anyway." They drove west as the sun climbed, leaving the sprawl of Reno behind, trading buildings and traffic lights for endless desert and sky. The landscape was beautiful in a harsh way, all muted browns and grays punctuated by the occasional burst of green, where something had found water. Joshua trees stood like sentinels, their twisted arms reaching up as if trying to touch something beyond the relentless blue. They talked about nothing important, the way men do when they're both carrying too much weight to discuss directly. Tommy told stories about ridiculous towing jobs, about the guy who'd called for help moving his van that turned out to be full of stolen auto parts, about the woman who'd locked her keys in her car 3 times in 1 week. Marcus laughed at the right moments, contributed his own stories about nightmare repair jobs, about the car held together with duct tape and prayer, about the customer who'd tried to change her own oil and somehow stripped every bolt in the process. They didn't talk about the war. They rarely did. Some things didn't need words between them. The auction site appeared around 7:30, shimmering in the distance like a mirage. A chain-link fence surrounded several acres of cracked concrete where dozens of vehicles sat in neat rows, ranging from relatively modern Humvees to Vietnam-era trucks to things Marcus couldn't even identify. A few temporary structures had been set up, including a raised platform that would serve as the auction stage, and a table where a woman was already processing early arrivals. There were maybe 20 people there when Marcus and Tommy pulled in, with more vehicles arriving steadily. The crowd was exactly what Marcus expected. Other veterans recognizable by their bearing and their 1,000-yard stares, professional scrappers with calculating eyes and grease-stained hands, a few collectors looking for specific pieces of military history, and the occasional wild card who'd heard about the auction and thought it sounded interesting. Everyone looked a little desperate, a little hungry. These weren't the kind of people who bought military equipment for fun. These were people who needed the opportunity, who were betting that they could turn rust and metal into rent money and second chances. Marcus and Tommy registered at the table, getting numbered paddles. Marcus's was 37, which felt somehow significant, though he couldn't say why. They wandered through the rows of equipment, Marcus's trained eye assessing each vehicle for potential. Most of it was junk, or near enough. The Humvees looked promising from a distance, but up close revealed the kind of damage that made them more trouble than they were worth. The trucks were in better shape but would go for more money than Marcus could afford. There was a row of Jeeps that might work, but the bidding on those would be competitive. And then, at the back of the lot, almost hidden behind a pile of scrap metal and rusted drums, Marcus saw it. An M60 Patton tank. It sat alone, as if the other vehicles had deliberately given it space, respecting its mass if not its condition. The tank was massive, easily 60 tons of steel and machinery, painted in a faded desert camouflage that had been bleached by decades of sun. Rust ate at the edges of the hull like a cancer. The treads looked worn but possibly salvageable. The barrel of the main gun pointed skyward at an angle, frozen in that position by mechanisms that probably hadn't moved since the Cold War ended. Marcus walked around it slowly, his mechanic's instincts overriding his common sense. The access hatches were sealed tight, rust and sand creating a bond that would take serious tools to break. But the hull itself seemed solid, no major breaches or structural damage that he could see. Someone had maintained this beast once, kept it functional and ready. Then they'd driven it out here, and forgotten about it, left it to bake under the Nevada sun, while wars moved on and technology evolved. And the kind of tank-on-tank combat this machine was built for became obsolete. "You're not seriously thinking about bidding on that?" Tommy said, coming up beside him. "How much you think it weighs?" Marcus asked instead of answering. 60, maybe 65 tons. "Why?" "That's a lot of scrap metal. Even at bottom dollar, you're talking 15, maybe 20 cents a pound. You do the math." Tommy pulled out his phone and calculated. If it's 60,000 pounds, at 20 cents a pound, that's $12,000. Minus cutting costs, hauling, disposal fees. You might clear 8 or 9,000. But Marcus, how the hell are you going to cut up a tank? You'd need industrial equipment, time, space. This isn't like stripping a car. Marcus knew all of that. Knew it was impractical. Knew it was a massive undertaking. Knew that between his day jobs and his physical limitations, it would take him months to break this thing down. But he also knew that $12,000 would solve every immediate problem in his life. Would pay the back rent, catch up the medical bills, buy Sophie that bike, and 1,000 other things she needed and deserved. "I'll figure it out," Marcus said. By 8 o'clock, maybe 40 people had gathered. The auctioneer climbed onto the platform, a sun-weathered man in his 50s wearing a straw cowboy hat and a western shirt with pearl snaps. He had the look of someone who'd spent his whole life in the desert, skin like leather and eyes that squinted against light even in shadow. "Morning, folks," he called out, his voice carrying across the lot with the practiced ease of someone who made his living talking. "Welcome to Redstone Surplus Liquidation. We got about 70 lots today. Everything from small parts to full vehicles. Rules are simple. Cash or cashier's check only. Minimum bid starts where I say it starts. You win it, you haul it, and all sales are final. No returns, no refunds. No crying when you realize you bought something you can't actually move. Everyone clear?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "Good. Let's get started." The first few lots went quickly. Pallets of spare parts sold to professional scrappers who knew exactly what they were buying and what they could get for it. A Vietnam-era Jeep went for $1,200 after spirited bidding between two collectors. A truck with a seized engine sold for $300 to a guy who claimed he could fix anything. Marcus watched it all with growing anxiety, his hand gripping his numbered paddle so tightly his knuckles turned white. He'd never done anything like this, never bid at an auction, never gambled this much money on a single decision. His heart rate climbed steadily, that familiar feeling of pre-combat adrenaline that he'd learned to recognize and hate. "You okay?" Tommy asked, quietly. "Yeah," Marcus lied. They worked through the lots methodically. The Humvees went for more than Marcus could afford, mostly to guys who ran adventure tour companies or had government contracts for spare vehicles. The better trucks found buyers. The Jeeps sold one by one, and slowly, inevitably, they got closer to the back of the lot. "Next up," the auctioneer called. "We got lot 43, M60 Patton tank, vintage 1968, decommissioned, sold as is for scrap or parts. Now I'm going to be straight with you folks. This beast is going to cost more to haul than most of you can afford. And once you get it home, you're going to need serious equipment to do anything with it. But she's solid steel. And there's a lot of pounds here, if you're in the scrapping business. Starting bid, $3,000. Silence. Marcus looked around. Nobody was moving. The professional scrappers had already calculated that the juice wasn't worth the squeeze, that the cost of hauling and cutting would eat up most of the profit. The collectors weren't interested in something this big and common. The wildcards had already spent their money on more practical purchases. "Come on, folks," the auctioneer said, sounding bored. $3,000 for 60 tons of American engineering. That's like $50 a ton. You can't beat that at retail. More silence. A few people had started drifting toward their vehicles. Their business concluded for the day. Marcus felt his hand starting to rise. Before his brain fully committed to the decision, Tommy grabbed his wrist. "Brother, think about this," Tommy whispered urgently. "That's your last money. Your everything money. If this doesn't work out, it'll work out," Marcus said. Though he had no idea if that was true, he pulled his wrist free and raised his paddle high. 3,000, he called out. The auctioneer's face lit up like he'd just watched someone volunteer for a suicide mission. "We got 3,000. Do I hear 3,500? Nobody moved. 3,000 going once. Anyone want to save this gentleman from himself?" A few nervous laughs from the crowd, but still no other bidders. 3,000 going twice. Marcus's heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his skull. This was it. This was the moment everything either changed or fell apart completely. "Sold." The auctioneer's voice rang out across the desert. "Lot 43 to paddle 37 for $3,000. Son, I hope you got a damn good trailer." Marcus lowered his paddle, his hand shaking. Around him, people were either looking at him with pity or very carefully not looking at him at all. He'd just spent every penny he had on 60 tons of steel that most people considered worthless. Tommy clapped him on the shoulder. "Well, we're committed now. Let's go pay the man and figure out how to get this beast home." The paperwork took 20 minutes. Marcus handed over 30 cashier's checks that he'd gotten from the bank yesterday, each one for $100, because that was the maximum his account would allow him to get in that form. The woman processing the sale barely looked at him, just stamped the papers and handed him a bill of sale and a receipt. "You got 72 hours to get it off the property," she said. "After that, we charge $100 a day storage." "We'll have it out of here today," Tommy assured her. Getting the tank onto Tommy's flatbed trailer was an engineering challenge that took 3 hours. A borrowed crane truck, 24 heavy-duty chains, and the help of 4 other guys who were loading their own purchases. The crane operator, a grizzled man named Pete, who'd clearly done this kind of thing before, kept shaking his head and muttering about load limits and center of gravity and a dozen other technical concerns that Marcus tried not to think about too hard. "This is either really smart or really stupid," Pete said as the tank finally settled onto the trailer with a groan of metal and wood. "I honestly can't tell which. I honestly can't tell." "Which? Me neither," Marcus admitted. They secured it with every chain and strap Tommy had in his truck, then added a few more for good measure. The whole rig looked absurd, precarious, like a child's toy scaled up to nightmare proportions. But the load was stable, or at least stable enough. And that would have to be good enough. By the time they started the long drive back to Reno, it was late afternoon. The temperature had climbed past 110 degrees, and the air conditioning in Tommy's truck was fighting a losing battle against the heat radiating from the desert floor. "You know," Tommy said as they merged onto the highway, "in all the years I've known you, this might be the craziest thing you've ever done." Marcus watched the tank in the side mirror, swaying slightly but holding steady. "You think I made a mistake?" I think you made a choice. Whether it's a mistake depends on what happens next." They drove in silence for a while, the desert sliding past in shades of brown and gold. "I had to do something," Marcus finally said. "I was drowning, Tommy. Every month falling further behind, every bill piling up, Sophie asking questions I couldn't answer. I needed something to change." "I know, brother. I know." They pulled into the lot behind Marcus's garage just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that almost made the industrial wasteland look beautiful. The garage was in a rough part of town, surrounded by auto body shops and junkyards and businesses that existed in the gray spaces between legal and not quite. But the rent was cheap, and the owner didn't ask questions about noise or hours, and Marcus had built something there, small and fragile but his. Getting the tank off the trailer was somehow more terrifying than getting it on. They used jacks and wood blocks and prayers, lowering it inch by inch, until it finally settled on the concrete pad behind the garage with a thud that Marcus felt in his bones. Tommy refused payment for the hauling, as Marcus knew he would. "Just promise me you'll be careful with this thing," Tommy said, "and call me if you need help breaking it down. I got torches and cutting equipment." After Tommy left, Marcus stood alone with his purchase as the desert night rolled in, bringing with it temperatures that finally dropped below triple digits. The tank sat in shadow, massive and silent, a monument to a war that had ended before Marcus was born. He thought about Sophie, about how he'd explain this to her, about whether she'd think her dad was brave or crazy, or some combination of both. He thought about his ex-wife's disappointed face, about the medical bills still sitting on his kitchen table, about the rent that was due in 12 days. But mostly he thought, I did it. I made a choice. I took action instead of just letting life happen to me. And whether that turned out to be brilliant or disastrous, at least it was his choice, his action, his attempt to build something different from the slow decline he'd been living. His leg was aching from the long day, and exhaustion was pulling at him like gravity. But instead of going upstairs to his apartment, Marcus grabbed a flashlight from his truck and approached the tank. The hatch on top was sealed tight, rust and sand, and time creating a bond that wouldn't yield to his first attempts to open it. He'd need tools, penetrating oil, patience, but he ran his hand along the hull, feeling the texture of the metal, the warmth still radiating from the day's heat, the weight of all that steel and history, and that's when he noticed it. The tank sat slightly tilted, the back end maybe an inch lower than the front. At first, he assumed it was just the way it had settled on the concrete, weight distribution based on where the heavy components sat internally. But something about it nagged at him, triggered some instinct he'd developed over years of diagnosing mechanical problems by sight and sound and feel. He walked around it again, this time more slowly, more carefully, his flashlight beam playing across every surface. He tested the treads, checking for obvious weight distribution issues. He examined the hull for any signs of internal damage or collapse that might explain the tilt. Nothing obvious. But the feeling persisted. Marcus had learned in the military to trust his instincts about machines. The mechanics who survived were the ones who could sense when something was wrong before the diagnostic equipment confirmed it, who could hear the difference between a normal engine noise and the first whisper of a catastrophic failure, who paid attention to the small details that didn't quite fit the pattern. This tank was wrong somehow. The weight distribution didn't match what it should be for an M60. The rear was too heavy, or the front was too light, or something was different from the factory specifications he'd memorized during his training years ago. It was fully dark now, the only light coming from his flashlight, and the distant glow of Reno on the horizon. Marcus should go inside, should get some sleep before his overnight shift at the grocery store in 6 hours. This could wait. The tank wasn't going anywhere, but he couldn't let it go. He climbed onto the hull, his injured leg protesting every movement, and started working on the hatch again. He applied penetrating oil to the locking mechanism, tapping gently with a hammer, working the rust-free degree by degree. It took an hour, his hands cramping, his back aching, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the cooling night air. Finally, something gave. The mechanism clicked, and the hatch groaned open an inch. Marcus pulled harder, muscles straining, and it swung wide with a shriek of tortured metal that echoed across the empty lot. He aimed his flashlight down into the darkness, and for the first time in 5 years, Marcus Webb felt something other than despair. He felt possibility. The interior of the tank was cramped, dusty, and surprisingly intact. Someone had driven this machine out to that storage lot and sealed it up carefully, preserving it against the elements. The instrumentation was outdated, analog dials and mechanical switches from an era before digital displays, but everything looked functional, frozen in time rather than destroyed by it. Marcus lowered himself carefully through the hatch, his leg complaining violently about the awkward angle. The space inside smelled like stale air and old grease, and the peculiar metallic scent that all military vehicles shared. His flashlight beam revealed a space that should have been familiar from his training, but something was different. The floor. Near the driver's position, where the floor panels should have been uniform, there was a seam, barely visible, carefully done, but definitely wrong. Someone had cut into the floor and replaced the panel, trying to hide the modification. Marcus knelt, ignoring the pain shooting through his leg, and traced his fingers along the seam. It wasn't a factory cut. This was field modification, done by someone who knew what they were doing but didn't have access to proper welding equipment. The cut was too rough, the panel fit too loose. His heart rate picked up, adrenaline flooding his system for the second time that day. During his deployment, he'd seen unauthorized modifications before. Soldiers created hidden compartments for personal items, contraband, things they didn't want inspectors to find. Usually, it was nothing serious. Family photos, alcohol, unauthorized electronics, but sometimes it was more. He grabbed a pry bar from his toolbox and worked it into the seam. The panel resisted at first, rust and time welding it in place more securely than the original work had. He applied steady pressure, working carefully, not wanting to damage whatever was underneath. The panel lifted free with a shriek of metal on metal. Below it was darkness, a space that shouldn't exist in the tank's design. Marcus aimed his flashlight down, and his breath caught in his throat. There was a compartment, maybe 3 feet by 2 feet, carved out of the space between the floor and the hull. And inside that compartment was a door. Not a panel, not a hatch, but a proper door with a combination lock, military grade, designed to keep secrets. Marcus sat back on his heels, his mind racing. This wasn't a hiding spot for cigarettes or personal items. This was engineered, deliberate, professional. Someone had gone to enormous trouble to create a secure vault inside this tank, hidden where no casual inspector would find it. The question was, why? And more importantly, what was inside. He spent the next hour examining the door, photographing it from every angle, testing the lock mechanism. It was old but well maintained. A 6-digit combination lock that wouldn't yield to anything but the correct sequence or serious force. He had neither. Finally, exhausted and overwhelmed, Marcus climbed out of the tank and stood under the desert stars. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the sound of the highway, the low rumble of trucks carrying goods across the country. Somewhere out there, Sophie was asleep in her room, dreaming whatever 9-year-olds dreamed about. Somewhere out there, his ex-wife was probably telling her new husband about Marcus's latest crazy scheme, shaking her head in disappointment. But here, in this moment, Marcus Webb stood beside 60 tons of steel that he'd bought with his last money, and he knew with absolute certainty that he'd just stumbled onto something that would change everything. He didn't know what was in that vault, didn't know if it was valuable or dangerous, or both, but he knew that the tank's unusual weight distribution finally made sense. Whatever was hidden inside was heavy, substantial, worth the enormous effort of creating a secret compartment. And tomorrow, when the sun rose and the desert heated up again, he would figure out how to open that door. Because Marcus Webb had spent 5 years running from his past, drowning in debt, watching his life slowly collapse under the weight of wounds both visible and invisible. But tonight, standing in the darkness with his hand on warm steel, he felt something he'd almost forgotten: hope. The tank wasn't just scrap metal anymore. It was possibility. It was potential. It was the chance that maybe, just maybe, everything was about to change. He just had to be brave enough, or desperate enough, or crazy enough to see it through. Marcus didn't sleep that night. How could he? Every time he closed his eyes, all he could see was that door, that lock, that secret sealed beneath the floor of a Cold War tank that he'd bought for scrap. He lay in his narrow bed in the apartment above the garage, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of traffic on the highway, his mind racing through possibilities and probabilities, and the 1,000 ways this could go wrong. At 3 in the morning, he gave up on sleep entirely and went back downstairs. The tank sat exactly where they'd left it, massive and silent in the darkness, keeping its secrets. Marcus stood beside it for a long time, his hand on the cool metal, feeling the weight of the decision he was about to make. He could walk away right now, could sell the tank as scrap, take his $8,000 or $9,000, pay some bills, survive another few months. Could pretend he'd never seen that door, never felt that unusual weight distribution, never wondered what was hidden inside. But he knew he wouldn't, couldn't, because whatever was in there, it had been waiting for decades to be found, and somehow, impossibly, it had found him. He climbed back inside with his toolbox, his flashlight, and a determination that surprised him. The combination lock wasn't something he could crack. Didn't have the skills or tools for that kind of work. But the hinges, those were mechanical, physical, something he understood. If he couldn't go through the lock, he'd go around it. The hinges were old military-grade steel, designed to last, but decades of sitting in the desert, heat and cold had taken their toll. Marcus studied them carefully in the beam of his flashlight, looking for weak points, places where time and temperature cycles had created microscopic fractures that he could exploit. He'd learned in the military that every machine, no matter how well built, eventually showed its vulnerabilities. You just had to be patient enough to find them. He started with penetrating oil, applying it liberally to every joint and seam, letting it seep into the microscopic spaces between metal surfaces. Then he waited, fighting the urge to rush, knowing that haste would only make the job harder. While the oil did its work, he sat in the cramped interior of the tank and let his mind drift back to another time, another desert, another life. Afghanistan had been hot too, but a different kind of hot. Dry and dusty, yes, but with a crispness to the air that Nevada never had. Marcus had been part of a maintenance unit attached to a forward operating base in Kandahar province, responsible for keeping the vehicles running in an environment that seemed specifically designed to destroy machinery. Sand got into everything: engines, transmissions, weapons systems, computers. They'd work 18-hour days sometimes, fixing the same problems over and over, knowing that the vehicles they repaired might be the only thing standing between some convoy and an ambush. He'd been good at it, really good, had a reputation for being able to diagnose problems by sound alone, for seeing patterns in mechanical failures that others missed. His commanding officer had put him in for a commendation. Said Marcus had the kind of instincts that couldn't be taught, only discovered. He'd been proud of that. Had called home to tell his wife. Had imagined coming back, a hero with skills that would translate into a successful civilian career. Then came the day that changed everything. They'd been transporting a broken-down Humvee back to base. Marcus, riding in the passenger seat of the recovery vehicle, going over his mental checklist of what needed to be fixed. The driver, a kid from Ohio named Rodriguez, had been telling a story about his little sister's quinceañera, making Marcus laugh despite his exhaustion. The sun had been setting, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold that almost made you forget where you were and why. Marcus didn't remember the explosion itself. The brain, in its mercy, had edited that part out, left only the before and the after. Before, laughter and sunset, and the rumble of diesel engines. After, pain like nothing he'd ever imagined, screaming that he distantly realized was his own voice, the acrid smell of burning rubber and flesh, hands pulling him from the wreckage, someone saying, stay with me, over and over like a prayer. Rodriguez hadn't made it. Neither had Corporal Chen. No, wait. Never used Chen. Neither had Corporal Matthews or Sergeant Williams. 3 men gone in an instant, vaporized by an IED buried in a road they'd driven down 100 times before. Marcus should have died too. The doctors told him later that it was a miracle he'd survived, that the way the shrapnel had torn through his body should have been fatal. They'd said it like he should be grateful. Like survival was always the better option. But sometimes, in the darkest moments, when the pain was worst and the nightmares wouldn't stop, and his wife looked at him like she was living with a stranger, Marcus wondered if the miracle had been real, or if he'd just been too stubborn to die when he was supposed to. The physical recovery had taken a year. Multiple surgeries to repair his leg, his lung, the internal damage from shrapnel that had carved a path through his body, like some cruel cartographer mapping routes of agony. Physical therapy that hurt worse than the original injury. Nurses who oscillated between sympathy and impatience. Doctors who talked about him like he wasn't in the room, discussing his prognosis and quality of life, in clinical terms that felt nothing like the reality of trying to walk 10 feet without screaming. But the physical wounds, as terrible as they were, the nightmares that had him waking up screaming, drenched in sweat, sometimes swinging at threats that weren't there, the panic attacks triggered by loud noises crowds, sudden movements. Anything that reminded his nervous system of danger. The depression that settled over him like a weighted blanket, making even simple tasks feel impossible. The anger that would flare up from nowhere, disproportionate and terrifying. His wife, Rebecca, had tried. He had to give her credit for that. She'd gone to the support groups, read the books, learned about PTSD and traumatic brain injury, and all the invisible wounds that came home from war. She'd been patient at first, understanding when Marcus couldn't hold down a job, when he spent days in bed unable to face the world, when he pushed her away because letting someone close felt like exposing a vital organ to danger. But patience has limits, understanding has boundaries, and Sophie, their daughter, had been only 4 years old when Marcus came home broken. She needed a father who could play with her, take her to the park, tuck her in at night without waking her with screams. She needed stability and safety, and the kind of normal childhood that Marcus no longer knew how to provide. The divorce had been finalized 2 years ago, amicable as these things went. Rebecca had gotten primary custody, which Marcus hadn't fought because he knew she was right. Sophie deserved better than what he could offer in his current state. He got her every other weekend and 1 night a week for dinner. Supervised visits at first, until the therapist agreed he was stable enough to be alone with his own daughter. Those visits were the best and worst parts of Marcus's week. Best because Sophie was pure and perfect, and loved him without conditions despite everything. Worst because every moment with her reminded him of everything he'd lost, everything he'd failed to be, every way he'd let her down. The oil had been soaking into the hinges for almost an hour. Marcus shook himself out of the memories, back to the present, back to the tank and the door and the secret waiting to be discovered. He selected a narrow chisel and a small hammer, positioning the chisel at the edge of the top hinge, where decades of temperature cycling had created a hairline fracture in the metal. He tapped gently, precisely, feeling for the moment when the metal would give. Too much force, and he'd damage the door, possibly whatever was inside. Too little, and he'd make no progress. It was delicate work, the kind that required patience and focus, and the ability to read metal like other people read books. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm was meditative, almost hypnotic. Tap, tap, tap. 3 hours later, as dawn light started filtering through the gaps in the garage walls, the top hinge finally surrendered. The pin slid free with a shriek of protest, and Marcus felt a surge of triumph that was immediately tempered by exhaustion. His hands were cramping, his back ached from the awkward position, and his injured leg felt like someone was driving nails through the bone. But he was making progress. He worked through the morning, taking breaks to stretch and hydrate, and remind his body that it was still alive despite its protests. By noon, the second hinge had yielded. By 3 in the afternoon, he was working on the third and final hinge, the one that bore most of the door's weight. That's when he heard the sound of small feet on the stairs leading up to his apartment. "Daddy?" Sophie's voice cut through his concentration like a knife. Marcus froze, his heart suddenly pounding for an entirely different reason than the vault. It wasn't his weekend with her. It was Thursday. She should be at school, or with her mother, or anywhere but here. He climbed out of the tank as quickly as his leg would allow, and found her standing at the top of the stairs, backpack on her shoulders, her dark eyes wide with worry. "Sophie." "Baby, what are you doing here? Where's your mom?" "She had to go to a work thing," Sophie said, coming down the stairs carefully. "She called you but you didn't answer." So she said I should take the bus to your garage because you're always here anyway. Marcus pulled his phone from his pocket and saw 7 missed calls from Rebecca. Guilt and anger warred in his chest. Guilt for not hearing the phone. Anger at his ex-wife for sending their 9-year-old daughter on a bus across town, instead of, he didn't know, cancelling her work thing or asking literally anyone else for help. But Sophie was here now. Safe. Looking at him with that expression of unconditional love that he absolutely did not deserve. You okay? She asked, studying his face with the perceptiveness that scared him sometimes. You look tired. Its mate was one sound. You look tired. I'm fine, baby. Just working on a project. He gestured toward the tank, which dominated the space like some prehistoric creature. What do you think? Pretty cool, right? Sophie's eyes went wide. The worry replaced by wonder. You got a tank? A real tank? You weigh. A real tank, Marcus confirmed, feeling a smile tug at his lips despite everything. Bought it at an auction. Going to strip it for parts. Sell the metal. She approached it slowly, reverently, her small hand reaching out to touch the hull. Can I go inside? Can I go inside? Every instinct in Marcus's body screamed no. The vault was open, or nearly so. He didn't know what was inside. Didn't know if it was safe. Didn't know anything except that he needed to keep his daughter as far away from whatever secrets this tank held as possible. Not today, he said gently. I need to make sure it's safe first. But I promise, once I've checked everything, I'll give you the full tour. Deal? Deal. She turned to look at him, and her expression shifted to something more serious. Older than her years. Daddy, are we okay? For money, I mean. Marcus's heart broke a little. 9 years old, and she was worrying about money, about bills, about adult problems that should never touch her. We're going to be fine, he said, kneeling down so he was at her level even though the position made his leg scream. This tank, it's going to help us a lot. But more important than money, you and me. We're solid. Always. You understand. She hugged him fiercely, her small arms strong around his neck. I understand. They spent the rest of the afternoon together. Marcus ordered pizza, the good kind from the place Sophie loved, not the cheap stuff he usually got. They ate sitting on the hood of a car he was supposed to be fixing, talking about her school and her friends, and the book she was reading about a girl who discovered she had magic powers. Sophie told him about her grades, all as except for 1 B in math, and about the science fair project she wanted to do about renewable energy. Marcus listened and asked questions and tried not to think about the vault waiting in the tank, about the secret that was pulling at him like gravity, about the decision he was going to have to make soon. As the sun started to set, Rebecca called. Her work thing had run late. She was so sorry. Could Marcus keep Sophie overnight? Of course, Marcus said, relief flooding through him. An unexpected night with his daughter felt like a gift, even though his apartment was barely big enough for one person, let alone 2. They made a nest on his couch with blankets and pillows, and watched a movie about talking animals that Sophie had seen a dozen times, but never got tired of. She fell asleep halfway through, her head on Marcus's shoulder, her breathing deep and even. Marcus sat there long after the movie ended, looking at his daughter's peaceful face, feeling the weight of responsibility and love and fear press down on him like a physical thing. Whatever was in that vault, whatever he decided to do with it, had to be for her. Had to give her the life she deserved, the opportunities she should have, the future that his broken body and broken mind had stolen from her. After he carried Sophie to his bed and tucked her in, after he'd checked the locks on the doors twice, because paranoia was just another gift from the war, Marcus went back downstairs to the tank. The third hinge came free just after midnight. With all 3 hinges removed, the door hung only by the lock mechanism itself. Marcus positioned a pry bar carefully and applied steady pressure. The door resisted, groaned, then surrendered all at once, falling inward with a metallic clang that seemed to echo through the entire garage. Marcus aimed his flashlight into the space beyond. The vault was about 4 feet deep, lined with what looked like lead or some other heavy metal, explaining the weight distribution that had first caught his attention. And inside, stacked carefully, sealed in waterproof containers, was a collection that made Marcus's hands start to shake. He pulled out the first container, his heart hammering. Inside were papers, official-looking documents with government seals, all marked with classification stamps and security clearances. He set them aside and reached for the next container. Bearer bonds. Dozens of them, each one printed on heavy paper with ornate borders and official seals. Marcus didn't know much about financial instruments, but he knew what bearer bonds were. Essentially cash in paper form, payable to whoever held them, no questions asked. The kind of thing governments used for black operations, for funding projects that couldn't go through official channels. He checked the dates. 1977, 1981, 1983. All from the Cold War era, all with face values that made his vision blur. $100,000. $500,000. $1 million. His hands were definitely shaking now. The next container held gold certificates, official documents certifying ownership of gold bullion held in Federal Reserve vaults. More Cold War artifacts, more untraceable wealth, designed to fund operations that officially didn't exist. Then came rare coins in sealed plastic cases, each one carefully labeled with dates and mint marks and notations about rarity. Marcus recognized some of them from his grandfather's modest collection: a 1909 SVDB Lincoln penny, a 1916 D Mercury dime, a 1933 Double Eagle gold piece. But these weren't modest. These were museum-quality specimens, each one worth thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. By the time Marcus had emptied the vault, the floor of the tank was covered with containers, and his mind was reeling with the implications. This wasn't just money. This was a Cold War cache, the kind of emergency fund that had been hidden around the world during the years when nuclear war seemed inevitable. Black budget money, completely untraceable, ready to be used for operations that would never appear in any official record. But why was it still here? Why hadn't anyone come back for it? The documents provided some answers. Marcus spread them out carefully, his flashlight beam moving across official memorandums, transfer orders, shipping manifests. He recognized some of the names from his military training, officers who'd been involved in Cold War operations. But one name appeared again and again: Colonel Harrison Vance. Marcus grabbed his phone and searched for the name. What he found made his blood run cold. Colonel Harrison Vance had been a decorated officer involved in covert operations during the late Cold War. But in the early 90s, there had been rumors, investigations that went nowhere, whispers about illegal weapons smuggling, about deals with foreign groups that Congress never approved, about money that disappeared from official budgets and reappeared in places it shouldn't be. Vance had retired in 1992, had died in 2014. The investigations had been quietly closed. The whispers had faded, and whatever truth there was had been buried along with the bodies and the secrets. Until now, Marcus sat back, his mind racing through implications and consequences. The documents he'd found detailed an operation spanning years, an illegal weapons smuggling ring that had funneled American arms to various groups around the world, all funded by off-the-books money that came from caches like this one. The bearer bonds and gold certificates weren't just wealth, they were evidence, proof of crimes that certain people had spent decades covering up. He pulled out his phone again and started calculating. The bearer bonds alone, if they were still valid, could be worth tens of millions. The gold certificates, tied to actual gold reserves, would be worth whatever gold was trading at today. The coins were harder to estimate without expert appraisal, but conservatively, they had to be worth several million. And the documents, the evidence they represented, those were either worthless or priceless, depending on who you asked. Marcus climbed out of the tank as dawn light started filtering through the garage again. He'd been awake for almost 48 hours, running on adrenaline and coffee, and the kind of manic energy that comes when your entire life pivots on a single discovery. He stood there looking at the containers, at the evidence spread across the floor of the tank, at the fortune that had somehow found its way into his hands, and felt the weight of decision pressing down on him. He could keep it, could hide it, cash in the bonds slowly over years, sell the coins through private dealers, never report any of it. The money would solve every problem in his life, would give Sophie the childhood she deserved, would let him finally stop drowning in debt and fear and the daily grind of survival. Nobody knew the vault existed. The tank had been sitting in that storage lot for decades, forgotten, abandoned. Whatever operation this cache had been part of was long over, the people involved mostly dead. Who would it hurt if Marcus just kept quiet and kept the money? But he knew the answer to that question. It would hurt him, would hurt the part of himself that had taken an oath to defend the Constitution. The part that had watched his brothers die in the desert, believing they were fighting for something that mattered. The part that wanted Sophie to grow up knowing her father was someone who did the right thing, even when it was hard. The documents proved corruption at the highest levels, proved that people had violated their oaths, had profited from illegal arms deals, had betrayed everything they were supposed to protect. And some of those people were still alive, still in positions of power, still able to do damage. Marcus had a choice. He could be the guy who found a fortune and kept it, or he could be the guy who exposed the truth, who held powerful people accountable, who did what was right, even though it would make his life infinitely more complicated. He was still wrestling with that decision when he heard footsteps on the stairs. Sophie appeared, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her hair a wild tangle. "Morning, Daddy. What are you doing?" Marcus looked at his daughter, at the innocence in her face, at the trust in her eyes that said she believed he could do anything, be anything, solve any problem. "I'm trying to figure out the right thing to do," he said honestly. Sophie came down the stairs and took his hand. "Mom says you always know the right thing to do. You just sometimes wish you didn't." Out of the mouths of babes, Marcus was making breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, because it was the only thing in his kitchen that wasn't expired or questionable, when his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Is this Marcus Webb?" The voice was male, professional, with an edge that Marcus recognized from years in the military. "Who's asking?" "My name's not important. What's important is that tank you bought last Saturday. I need to know if you've opened it yet. Every muscle in Marcus's body went rigid. I don't know what you're talking about. Mr. Webb, please don't waste both our time. The M60 Patton, Lot 43, purchased for $3,000. Have you accessed the interior compartment? Marcus's mind raced. How did this person know about the compartment? How did they know he'd bought the tank? How long had they been watching? Who are you? Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the fear crawling up his spine. Someone who knows what's in that tank and wants it back. Someone who's willing to pay generously for its return. No questions asked. $50,000. Cash. If you hand over the contents intact and forget you ever saw them, and if I don't, a pause. Then things get complicated. Mr. Webb, you're a veteran. You understand how operations work. Some things are better left buried. Some secrets aren't meant to be discovered. Take the money, move on with your life. Let the past stay in the past. The line went dead. Marcus stood there holding the phone, his heart pounding, his mind racing through possibilities. Someone had been watching the auction or watching the storage lot. Or maybe they'd been trying to retrieve the cash themselves, but lost track of the tank. Now they knew he had it. Knew he'd probably opened it, knew what he'd found. $50,000 was a lot of money. More than enough to solve his immediate problems, but it was also an admission that what he'd found was valuable enough, dangerous enough, that someone was willing to pay to make it disappear, which meant the documents were probably more important than the money, which meant there were people out there who had something to lose if the truth came out. Sophie appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, sensing something was wrong with the instinct children have. Daddy, what's going on? Nothing, baby. Just work stuff. You hungry? But it wasn't nothing. And they both knew it. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. That afternoon, after Marcus had dropped Sophie off at her mother's house and endured Rebecca's questions about why he looked like he hadn't slept in days, he returned to the garage to find someone waiting for him. Two someones, actually. A black sedan was parked in front of the garage, and two men in suits stood beside it, their postures radiating the kind of authority that made civilians nervous, and made veterans immediately assess threat levels and exit strategies. They weren't trying to hide their presence. They wanted to be seen. Wanted Marcus to know they were there. Marcus pulled his truck up slowly, his injured leg already starting to throb with the stress response his body had learned in Afghanistan. He climbed out carefully, keeping his hands visible, his movements non-threatening. Marcus Webb, the older of the two men asked. He was maybe 50, with salt and pepper hair, and the kind of face that had seen too much and forgotten how to show surprise. That's me. I'm Agent Dale Morrison, Department of Defense. This is Agent Chen. Wait, no. Never use Chen. This is Agent Richards. We need to talk about a purchase you made last Saturday. You got a warrant? Marcus asked. Morrison smiled thinly. We're not here to search anything, Mr. Webb. We're here to have a conversation. Maybe answer some questions you have about that tank sitting behind your garage. Marcus considered his options. He could refuse to talk to them, could tell them to get a warrant or get lost. But that would just delay the inevitable, would make them more suspicious, would escalate a situation that was already spiraling beyond his control. Okay, he said, let's talk. They went into the garage, and Marcus was acutely aware of the tank sitting 20 feet away. The vault still open. The evidence still scattered inside where he'd left it that morning. If these agents had a warrant, if they decided to search, it was all over. His decision would be made for him. But Morrison didn't even glance at the tank. He pulled out a folder and opened it, showing Marcus photographs. The tank at the auction. The tank being loaded onto Tommy's flatbed. The tank being unloaded at the garage. Someone had been documenting every step. "You've been busy," Morrison said. "3 days ago, we flagged this vehicle when it appeared at the Redstone auction. Unfortunately, by the time we got authorization to secure it, you'd already purchased it and removed it from the lot. Why would the Department of Defense care about one old tank at a surplus auction?" Marcus asked. "Because that particular tank has a history. A history that certain people would prefer stayed forgotten. When it was supposed to be scrapped in 1989, someone diverted it to a private storage facility instead. We've been looking for it for a long time." Marcus felt his mouth go dry. "Looking for what? Exactly?" Richard spoke for the first time, his voice softer than Morrison's, almost sympathetic. "Mr. Webb, we know you've opened the compartment. We know you've seen what's inside. What we need to know is what you plan to do with what you found." There it was. The question that had been keeping Marcus awake. The choice that would define everything that came next. He could lie. Could claim he hadn't found anything. Hadn't opened the vault. Hadn't seen the evidence that could bring down powerful people. But these agents clearly already knew. Or, at least, suspected. Lying would just make him look guilty, would make whatever came next worse. Or he could tell the truth. Could hand over everything he'd found, let the government handle it. Trust that the system would work the way it was supposed to. But the phone call that morning, the offer of $50,000 to forget everything, suggested that the system wasn't exactly impartial here. That there were people who wanted this buried, not exposed. "I'm a veteran," Marcus said slowly. "Served in Afghanistan, got blown up. Spent a year recovering. Came home to find out that the country I bled for didn't have much use for broken soldiers. I'm drowning in medical debt. Working 3 part-time jobs, barely seeing my daughter. So, yeah, I found something in that tank. Found something that could change my life. Give my kid the future she deserves." He met Morrison's eyes directly. "But I also found documents, evidence of crimes, proof that people in positions of trust violated their oaths and got away with it. And I need to know, before I decide what to do next, are you here to make sure the truth comes out, or are you here to make sure it stays buried?" The two agents looked at each other. Some unspoken communication passed between them. Then Morrison closed the folder and sat back. "That's a complicated question, Mr. Webb. I've got time for a complicated answer." Morrison rubbed his face, suddenly looking tired. 20 years ago, I was part of a task force investigating irregularities in Cold War-era operations. We found evidence of weapons smuggling, unauthorized deals, missing money. We traced it back to a network of officers who'd been running their own private operations, funding them with black budget money that was supposed to be destroyed after the Cold War ended. He paused. "We built a case, had documents, testimony, everything we needed, and then someone higher up decided it wasn't in the national interest to prosecute. Said it would embarrass the military, damage international relationships, open up liability issues. The investigation was shut down. The evidence was sealed, and everyone involved was told to forget what they'd found. "And you did?" Marcus asked. "I'm a soldier, Mr. Webb. I follow orders, even when I don't agree with them. But I never forgot. Never stopped believing that the truth matters, that people should be held accountable. When this tank showed up at that auction, when we realized what might be inside, I volunteered for this assignment. Because maybe, after 20 years, I get a second chance to do the right thing." Richards nodded. "We're not here to bury this, Mr. Webb. We're here to help you expose it, if that's what you choose. But you need to understand what you're getting into. The people named in those documents, they're powerful. They have connections, resources, the ability to make your life very difficult. If you go public with this, if you blow the whistle, you become a target. You and your daughter both." Marcus felt ice water run down his spine. "You're saying they'd go after Sophie. Race. I'm saying that desperate people do desperate things. But we can protect you, can put you in contact with the right people, get you legal representation, make sure the evidence reaches investigators who can't be bought or intimidated. We can help you do this right." "Why?" Marcus asked. "Why risk your careers, your reputations, to help some broken veteran you don't even know?" Morrison smiled for the first time, and it was genuine. "Because you're not the only one who took an oath, Mr. Webb. Some of us still believe in it." Then 40 minus stain, 200. They talked for 2 more hours. Morrison and Richards explained the process, the legal protections available to whistleblowers, the channels through which the evidence could be released to ensure it couldn't be suppressed. They gave him contact information for attorneys who specialized in these cases, for journalists who'd broken major corruption stories before, for congressional staffers who'd been waiting for years for evidence like this. But they also made clear that once Marcus started down this path, there was no turning back. His life would become public, scrutinized, picked apart by lawyers and media, and everyone with an agenda. The money from the cash would probably be tied up in legal battles for years. He'd be called to testify, possibly before Congress, definitely in criminal trials. His past would be examined, his credibility questioned, every mistake he'd ever made brought into the light. And through all of it, he'd need to be strong enough to see it through, strong enough to withstand the pressure, the threats, the attacks that would come from people who wanted the truth to stay buried. "Can I think about it?" Marcus asked, as the sun started to set, painting the garage in shades of gold and shadow. "You can," Morrison said. "But don't take too long. Whoever called you this morning, whoever offered you money to keep quiet, they know where you live. They know about your daughter. Every day you wait is a day they have to escalate their efforts to silence you." After the agents left, Marcus sat alone in the gathering darkness, listening to the sounds of the city settling in for the night. He thought about Sophie, about the life she deserved versus the danger he might be putting her in. He thought about his brothers who died in Afghanistan, about whether they'd approve of what he was considering or think he was crazy to risk everything for the sake of principle. He thought about the phone call, the offer of $50,000 to forget everything. It would be so easy to take the money, to let the past stay buried, to focus on survival instead of justice. But then he remembered something his grandfather had told him once, back when Marcus was young and the world still made sense. "Son," the old man had said, "doing the right thing isn't about whether it's easy or hard, whether it costs you or benefits you. It's about being able to look yourself in the mirror and recognize the person looking back. Money comes and goes. Principles are what you carry with you every day of your life. Marcus pulled out his phone and looked at his recent calls. Morrison's number was there, along with a text message that simply read, "When you're ready." He typed out a response, "I'm ready. Let's do this." Then he sent a second message, this one to Tommy. "Need your help. Something big. Are you in?" The response came back almost immediately. "Always, brother. What do you need?" Marcus smiled despite everything. Despite the fear and uncertainty and the knowledge that his life was about to get infinitely more complicated. He wasn't alone in this. He had brothers who had his back, agents who believed in justice, and a daughter who deserved to grow up in a world where truth mattered more than power. The vault was open now. The secrets were exposed, and there was no going back. All that remained was to see it through, whatever the cost. The first thing Marcus did after sending those messages was secure the evidence. He wasn't naive enough to think that his decision to come forward would be welcomed by everyone involved. Someone had already called offering money to keep quiet, which meant someone was scared enough of exposure to take action. And scared people, Marcus had learned in Afghanistan, were often the most dangerous. He spent that entire night photographing every document, every bearer bond, every gold certificate, every coin. His phone's camera wasn't ideal, but it captured enough detail to prove what he'd found. He uploaded everything to 3 separate cloud storage accounts, each one password protected and set to automatically share with trusted contacts if he didn't check in every 72 hours. Insurance, in case something happened to him, or the physical evidence. Then he carefully repacked everything into the waterproof containers and moved them out of the tank. The garage had a floor safe, installed by the previous tenant and left behind when the lease changed hands. It was old, and the combination lock was finicky, but it was bolted into the concrete foundation and would take serious effort to break into. Marcus loaded the containers inside, memorized the new combination he'd set, and covered the safe with a heavy workbench. By the time the sun rose on Friday morning, Marcus had been awake for nearly 60 hours. His hands shook from exhaustion and too much coffee. His injured leg had progressed from aching to actively screaming. But the evidence was secure, backed up, and ready to be turned over to people who could actually do something with it. He showered, changed into clean clothes, and tried to make himself look like someone credible rather than someone in the middle of a mental breakdown. Then he sat down at his small kitchen table and started making calls. The first was to Major Sarah Reeves, the military investigator he'd worked with in Afghanistan. They'd kept in loose contact over the years, the occasional email or text on holidays, the kind of connection that forms between people who've been through something intense together. Sarah had been investigating supply chain corruption when Marcus was deployed, and she'd been one of the few officers who'd actually listened when lower-ranking personnel reported problems. She answered on the third ring, her voice crisp and professional. "Reeves, Major, it's Marcus Webb, from the 207th Maintenance Unit." A pause. Then her voice softened slightly. "Webb? Jesus, it's been what, 5 years? You doing okay?" "That's complicated," Marcus said. "I need to talk to you about something big. Are you still investigating corruption cases?" He heard the shift in her tone, from social to operational. "I am. What have you got?" Marcus took a deep breath and told her everything. The tank, the vault, the bearer bonds and documents, the phone call offering money to stay quiet, the DOD agents who'd shown up yesterday. He talked for 20 minutes straight, barely pausing for breath, knowing that if he stopped, he might lose the courage to continue. When he finally finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Webb," Sarah finally said, "do you have any idea what you've stumbled into?" "I'm getting a pretty good idea, yeah. The names in those documents, some of them are people who are still active in government, still have power, connections, the ability to make problems disappear. If even half of what you're describing is authentic, this is the biggest military corruption case in decades, maybe ever. So you'll help me?" Marcus asked. "Hell yes, I'll help you. But Webb, you need to understand what you're signing up for. These people will come at you with everything they have. They'll dig up every mistake you've ever made, every bad decision, every moment of weakness. They'll question your mental health, your motivations, your credibility. They'll make you wish you'd never found that tank. Someone already offered me $50,000 to forget about it," Marcus said. "I turned them down." Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Then you're braver than most, or crazier. Maybe both. Give me 24 hours. I need to bring this to my commanding officer. Get authorization to open an investigation. In the meantime, don't talk to anyone else. Don't touch the evidence. Don't do anything that could compromise the chain of custody, or give them ammunition to discredit you later." "What about the DOD agents who came to see me?" "Morrison and Richards." Another pause. "Dale Morrison, salt and pepper hair, looks like he's seen too much. That's him. He's one of the good ones. If he says he'll help you, he means it. But even the good ones have to follow orders, and if those orders come from high enough up the chain, there's only so much he can do. You need someone outside the military system. Someone who can't be ordered to stand down." "Like who?" "Like me. Once I retire in 3 months. Like journalists who've broken these kinds of stories before. Like congressional investigators who've been waiting years for evidence like this. I'll make some calls, get you connected with people who can help. But Webb, promise me something." "What?" "Promise me you're sure about this, because once we start this ball rolling, there's no stopping it. Your life is about to become very public, very complicated, and very dangerous. If you have any doubts, if you're not absolutely committed, walk away now before it's too late." Marcus thought about Sophie, about the life she deserved versus the danger he might be putting her in. He thought about the phone call, the offer of money, the easy path that would solve his immediate problems while letting crimes stay buried. He thought about his brothers who died believing they were fighting for something that mattered, about the oath he'd taken, about the kind of man he wanted his daughter to think he was. "I'm sure," he said. That afternoon, Tommy arrived with 3 other veterans Marcus knew from various support groups and VA meetings over the years. Jake, a former Marine with a prosthetic leg and a law degree he'd earned after coming home. Dominic, an Army medic who now ran a small security company. And Chen, never used Chen. And Patterson, a Navy veteran who'd done intelligence work and knew how to spot surveillance. They gathered in Marcus's apartment, and he explained the situation as directly as he could. He didn't sugarcoat the danger, didn't minimize the risks they'd be taking just by associating with him. He gave them every opportunity to walk away. Nobody moved. "Brother," Jake said, "we didn't survive what we survived just to come home and watch powerful people get away with betraying everything we fought for. You need help. You've got it. Whatever it takes. Dominic nodded. My company can provide security, at least basic stuff. Make sure nobody gets to you or your daughter without us knowing about it. No charge, just brothers looking out for each other. I can sweep your place for bugs, Patterson offered. Check your car, your phone. Make sure nobody's monitoring your communications. Basic counterintelligence. Stuff I used to do in the Navy. Tommy just gripped Marcus's shoulder. Told you already, brother. We've got your six. Always have. Always will. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion he couldn't quite name. For 5 years, he'd felt alone, isolated, disconnected from the brotherhood that had sustained him through deployment. But now, when it mattered most, that brotherhood was showing up in ways he'd never expected. Thank you, he managed to say. All of you. I don't know how to. You don't need to say anything, Jake interrupted. Just let us help. That's what we're here for. Patterson spent the next 2 hours sweeping Marcus's apartment and garage. He found 3 listening devices, one in the garage office, one in Marcus's truck, and one on the outside of his apartment door. All of them were sophisticated, probably government grade, and recently installed. Someone's been listening to everything, Patterson said, his face grim. Probably since right after you bought the tank. Good news is, they're passive devices, just recording and transmitting. Bad news is, whoever planted them knows pretty much everything you've said and done for the past week. Marcus felt violation wash over him like ice water. Someone had been in his home, his space, listening to his conversations with Sophie, invading his privacy in the most fundamental way. Can we use this? Jake asked, his lawyer mind already working. Illegal surveillance, violation of privacy rights, that's got to be worth something in court. Maybe, Patterson said. Depends on who planted them. If it was government doing it under some kind of national security justification, they'll claim they had authorization. If it was private contractors or individuals acting without sanction, then yeah, it's a felony. Either way, it tells us they're scared, and they're watching. Dominic had been on his phone, organizing. I've got 2 guys who can be here in an hour to set up basic security. Cameras on the garage and apartment, motion sensors, the works. Not military grade, but enough to know if someone's approaching. And I'll have someone sitting in a car outside 24/7 until this is resolved. I can't afford that, Marcus protested. Did I ask you to pay? This is what we do for family. Marcus, you don't get to argue. That evening, Major Sarah Reeves called back. Her voice was tight, with barely controlled anger. I briefed my commanding officer, she said. Showed him copies of the documents you sent. You know what he told me within 2 hours of that briefing. What? To drop it. Close the case file. Forget I'd seen anything. Move on to other priorities. When I pushed back, asked for justification, he said it came from above his pay grade. Someone with enough juice to kill an investigation before it even starts made a phone call. Marcus's heart sank. So that's it? We're done? Hell no, we're not done. I'm furious. Webb, absolutely furious. Because this is exactly the kind of corruption we're supposed to be fighting against. And instead we're being ordered to enable it. So I made some calls of my own. Off the record. I've got a contact at the Washington Post. Investigative journalist named Michael Torres. He's broken stories about military corruption before. Won a Pulitzer for exposing contractor fraud. If you're willing, I can connect you too. Let him verify the documents. Tell your story. Make this too big and too public for them to bury. What about protecting the evidence? I'll hand-carry copies to the Inspector General's office myself, along with a formal complaint about the order to stand down. Create a paper trail they can't erase. But Webb, once this goes to the media, things are going to move fast. You ready for that? Marcus thought about the listening devices Patterson had found, about the surveillance he'd been under without knowing it, about the people powerful enough to kill a military investigation with a single phone call. I'm ready, he said. Set up the meeting. The story leaked before Marcus was ready for it. He woke up Saturday morning to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. The first news alert he saw made his blood run cold. Disabled veteran claims, discovery of illegal Cold War weapons cache worth hundreds of millions. Someone had talked. Someone had leaked enough details to get the media interested, and now his name was spreading across the internet faster than he could track. By 9 in the morning, there were reporters camped outside his garage. By noon, the story was trending on social media. By evening, he'd been contacted by 6 different news organizations, 3 law firms, 2 book agents, and 1 person claiming to be a Hollywood producer. His phone rang constantly. Emails flooded his inbox. People he hadn't talked to in years suddenly wanted to reconnect, to offer help, to get close to the story. It was overwhelming and terrifying, and made Marcus want to hide in his apartment and never come out. Sophie called, confused and scared. Daddy, why are people asking about you at school? Why is your picture on the news? Marcus's heart broke. Baby, I need you to stay at Mom's for a while, okay? Don't talk to any reporters. Don't answer questions from strangers. Can you do that for me? Are you in trouble? Her voice was small, frightened in a way that made Marcus want to find whoever had leaked the story and make them understand what they'd done to his daughter's sense of safety. No, baby. I'm not in trouble. I just found something important, and now I have to make sure it goes to the right people. But I need you to be safe while I do that. Your mom's going to keep you home from school for a few days, and Uncle Tommy's going to be checking in. Everything's going to be okay. He wasn't sure if he was lying or not. Rebecca called 30 seconds after he hung up with Sophie. What the hell, Marcus? What did you do? Sophie's terrified. There are reporters calling my house. My husband is furious. I know. Marcus interrupted. I'm sorry. I'm handling it. Handling it? You're on the news. They're saying you found some kind of illegal military cache, that you're accusing high-ranking officials of crimes. Do you have any idea what this means for Sophie? For her safety? Than, manager. Than. I've got security on her, Marcus said. Dominic's company is watching both your house and my place. Nobody's getting near her without us knowing about it. Security? Jesus Christ, Marcus. What have you gotten us into? And, quote, something bigger than I expected, he admitted. But Rebecca, I found evidence of real crimes, proof that people violated their oaths and got away with it for decades. I couldn't just walk away from that. Yes, you could have. You absolutely could have. You could have thought about your daughter, about giving her a normal life, instead of dragging her into whatever crusade you've decided to go on. But that's always been your problem, hasn't it? You care more about principles than people. The accusation stung because part of him wondered if she was right. Was he being selfish? Was he putting his need to do the right thing ahead of Sophie's need for stability and safety? I'm trying to give her a world worth living in, Marcus said quietly. A world where truth matters, where powerful people can't just get away with crimes because they're powerful. Isn't that worth fighting for? Rebecca was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer but no less worried. Just promise me you'll keep her safe. Whatever else happens, whatever you've gotten yourself into, promise me Sophie won't pay the price for your principles. I promise, Marcus said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The threat started that night. The first was a phone call from a blocked number. A digitally altered voice, untraceable, telling Marcus in explicit detail what would happen to him and his family if he didn't stop talking, didn't hand over the evidence, didn't disappear quietly. The second was an email containing photographs of Sophie leaving school, walking to the bus stop, sitting in her mother's living room visible through a window. The message was brief. We can reach her anytime we want. The third was a brick through Marcus's apartment window at 2 a.m, wrapped in a note that simply said, "Last warning." Marcus called Dominic immediately. Within 20 minutes, there were 4 veterans stationed around his property, all armed, all furious that someone would threaten one of their own. Rebecca's house got similar protection, though she wasn't happy about armed men sitting in a van across the street. "This is insane," she said when Marcus called to explain. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. You've put all of us in danger because you couldn't just walk away. I'm not going to let anything happen to Sophie," Marcus said. "I swear to you, Rebecca. I'd die before I let someone hurt her." "That's not as reassuring as you think it is," she replied, and hung up. Patterson traced the threats as best he could. The phone call had bounced through several international servers, professionally done to avoid detection. The email had originated from a public library computer in Denver, used once and never again. The brick had no fingerprints, no trace evidence, nothing that could identify who'd thrown it. "Whoever's doing this knows what they're doing," Patterson said. "Government-level operational security, or private contractors who've been trained by the same people. They're trying to scare you without leaving evidence that could be traced back to them." "Is it working?" Tommy asked. Marcus looked at the boarded-up window, at the photographs of Sophie that someone had taken without her knowing, at the brother veterans surrounding him who dropped everything to protect him and his daughter. "Yeah," he admitted. "It's working. I'm terrified. But I'm not backing down." The legal battles began almost immediately. The Department of Justice filed a claim asserting that the bearer bonds and gold certificates were government property, stolen during the Cold War, and must be returned immediately. A private law firm representing unnamed parties with an interest in the matter filed a separate claim arguing that the cash had been legally obtained by their clients, and Marcus had no right to possess it. Jake, using his law degree for the first time since passing the bar, helped Marcus file a counterclaim. As the legal purchaser of the tank at a legitimate government auction, Marcus argued, he had legal right to whatever contents came with it. The bonds and certificates were bearer instruments, meaning ownership transferred to whoever held them, and the documents were evidence of crimes, which belonged in the hands of prosecutors, not buried in someone's vault. "This is going to get messy," Jake warned. "Multiple parties claiming ownership, federal jurisdiction questions, criminal investigations running parallel to civil cases. We could be in court for years." "I don't care about the money anymore," Marcus said. "I care about the truth coming out, about the documents being examined by people who can actually do something with them. Then we make that the focus," Jake said. "We don't fight over the financial assets." We fight for your right to turn over the evidence to investigators, journalists, congressional committees. We make transparency the goal, not personal enrichment. That plays better publicly and makes it harder for them to paint you as just another guy trying to profit from finding government property. The media coverage was relentless and often brutal. Some outlets painted Marcus as a hero, a whistleblower exposing decades of corruption. Others suggested he was mentally unstable, a damaged veteran whose PTSD made him unreliable and possibly delusional. His service record was dissected publicly. His medical discharge, his PTSD diagnosis, his failed marriage, his financial problems, all of it became fodder for talking heads debating his credibility. One particularly vicious cable news segment suggested that Marcus had fabricated the entire thing, that the documents were forgeries, that he was trying to scam the government for money he didn't deserve. They brought on a retired colonel who'd served with Harrison Vance, who defended his former commander and called Marcus's accusations the desperate lies of a broken man looking for attention. Marcus watched the segment with Tommy and Jake, feeling his anger rise with every word. "They're destroying me," he said, "making me look like a crazy person, a liar, someone not worth believing." "That's the playbook," Jake said. "When you can't discredit the evidence, you discredit the messenger. They're trying to undermine you before the investigation even gets started, poisoning the well so that when the truth comes out, people will already doubt it. So how do we fight back? We don't. Not directly. We let the evidence speak for itself. Michael Torres is doing his due diligence, verifying the documents with experts. Major Reeves is building a case through official channels. We focus on staying alive, staying sane, and not giving them ammunition to use against you. No angry outbursts, no threats, no behavior that confirms their narrative that you're unstable. That was easier said than done. Every day brought new stress, new threats, new attacks on his character. Marcus started having nightmares again, worse than they'd been in years. He'd wake up screaming, convinced that Sophie was in danger, that the explosion was happening again, that everything he'd tried to build was falling apart. But he also found support in unexpected places. A group of veterans organized a GoFundMe to help with his legal expenses. Within 48 hours, it had raised over $200,000 from people who believed in what he was doing, who understood that standing up for truth shouldn't mean financial ruin. Professor Richard Stone, a retired Air Force colonel who taught military history at UNLV, reached out, offering to authenticate the documents pro bono. "I testified before Congress in '91 about irregularities in Cold War weapons programs," Stone explained. "They buried my report, forced me into early retirement, told me I was seeing conspiracies where none existed. If what you found proves I was right all along, I want to help make sure the truth gets out this time." Stone spent 3 days examining copies of the documents, cross-referencing them with declassified records, interviewing other retired officers who'd served during the same period. His final report was unequivocal. The documents were authentic, the operation they described was real, and the crimes they documented were serious enough to warrant immediate investigation. "This is extraordinary," Stone said, his hands shaking slightly as he held the report. 30 years I've been waiting for proof like this. 30 years of being told I was wrong, paranoid, seeing things that weren't there. And here it is. Everything I testified about, and more. You've given me vindication, Marcus. And I'm going to make damn sure the world knows the truth." Michael Torres, the Washington Post journalist Sarah had connected him with, finally published his story 3 weeks after Marcus first opened the vault. The headline was stark and uncompromising. Cold War cache discovered in Nevada reveals decades of military corruption and cover-up. The article was exhaustive, running over 8,000 words across multiple pages. Torres had verified every major claim, interviewed dozens of sources, obtained copies of the key documents through multiple channels to ensure authenticity. He detailed the weapons smuggling operation, traced the money through various Cold War conflicts, and named names of officials who were still alive and still in positions of influence. The response was immediate and explosive. 2 senators called for immediate congressional hearings. The Attorney General announced the appointment of a special prosecutor to investigate the allegations. 3 retired officers were served with subpoenas, and the Secretary of Defense was forced to hold a press conference addressing questions about how such a massive operation could have been hidden for so long. But the backlash was equally fierce. Conservative media outlets attacked Torres as biased, attacked Marcus as unreliable, attacked the whole story as a liberal conspiracy to undermine trust in the military. Right-wing politicians gave speeches defending the officers named in the documents, suggesting that whatever they'd done was justified by the needs of fighting the Cold War. The court of public opinion was deeply divided. Some people saw Marcus as a hero, others saw him as a traitor trying to tear down American institutions. Death threats increased. So did letters of support. It seemed like everyone in the country had an opinion about what he'd done and whether it was right or wrong. Through it all, Marcus tried to stay focused on Sophie. He video called her every night, let her tell him about her day, avoided talking about the news coverage, or the threats, or the stress that was slowly crushing him. He wanted to be present for her, to be the father she needed, even as his world was spinning out of control. One night, about a month after the story broke, Sophie asked him a question that stopped him cold. "Daddy, do you regret finding the tank?" Marcus considered lying, considered giving her the simple answer that would make her feel better. But he'd always tried to be honest with her, age-appropriately honest, and he wasn't going to stop now. "Sometimes," he admitted, "when people are mean to me, or when I'm scared about keeping you safe, or when I'm so tired I can barely think straight. Yeah, sometimes I regret it. Sometimes I wish I'd just walked away, taken the easy path." "But," Sophie prompted, because she knew him well enough to hear the unspoken continuation, "but most of the time, I don't regret it. Because what I found was proof that powerful people did bad things and got away with it. And I couldn't just ignore that. Couldn't just let it stay buried, because exposing it was hard. You taught me that. Actually, I did. Yeah. Remember last year when you told me about that girl at school who was being mean to your friend, and you stood up to her, even though you were scared she'd start being mean to you too?" Sophie nodded. "That's what this is. Standing up to people who are doing wrong things, even when it's scary, even when it costs you something. You showed me how to do that. So, no, baby. I don't regret it. I'm proud of what I found and what I'm doing with it. And someday, when you're older, I hope you'll be proud too." Sophie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm already proud, Daddy. You're the bravest person I know." Marcus had to mute the call for a minute while he cried. The congressional hearings began in late November, 4 months after Marcus first bought the tank. He was subpoenaed to testify, along with Major Reeves, Professor Stone, and several retired officers who'd served during the Cold War era. The night before his testimony, Marcus sat in a hotel room in Washington, D.C., unable to sleep, running through the statement he'd prepared with Jake's help. Tomorrow he'd sit in front of cameras and senators and tell his story to the nation. Tomorrow he'd answer questions designed to either establish his credibility or destroy it. Tomorrow he'd look into the faces of people who wanted him silenced and refused to be silent. Tommy had flown out with him, refusing to let Marcus face this alone. They sat together watching cable news coverage of the hearing, listening to pundits predict what would happen, what Marcus would say, whether he'd hold up under questioning. "You ready for this?" Tommy asked. "No," Marcus admitted. "But I'm doing it anyway." "No, that's all courage is, brother. Being scared shitless and doing the thing anyway." The hearing room was packed when Marcus entered the next morning. Cameras lined the back wall. Reporters filled the press gallery. Spectators crowded every available seat, some there to support him, others to watch him potentially fall apart under scrutiny. Marcus sat at the witness table, his injured leg throbbing from the stress, his hands shaking slightly as he placed them on the wooden surface. He looked up at the senators arrayed before him, at the seal of the United States hanging behind them, at the flags representing a country he'd bled for and was now asking to do better. The chairwoman, Senator Patricia Morrison, gavelled the hearing to order. "Mr. Webb, thank you for appearing before this committee today. Before we begin questions, I want to address something directly. You've been criticized in some quarters as someone seeking attention or profit, as someone whose mental health issues make you unreliable. Some have questioned your motivations, your credibility, your right to make the accusations you've made. I want to give you an opportunity to respond to those criticisms directly. Why did you come forward with this information?" Marcus leaned toward the microphone, his voice steady, despite the fear thrumming through his veins. "Senator, I came forward because I took an oath. When I joined the military, I swore to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That oath didn't end when I took off the uniform. It didn't end when I got blown up and spent a year learning to walk again. It didn't end when I came home to find that the country I served had more interest in forgetting about broken veterans than helping us heal." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "The documents I found prove that people in positions of trust violated that same oath. They used their authority to profit from illegal weapons sales. They betrayed everything they were supposed to protect. And they got away with it for 30 years because nobody had the evidence to hold them accountable. I have a 9-year-old daughter. She asked me what I found in that tank, and I told her I found treasure that belonged to everyone, not just me. And she said, 'So you're going to return it?' And I realized that's exactly what this is. The money, the evidence, the truth, it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the American people, who deserve to know how their tax dollars were stolen and their trust was betrayed." He looked directly at the camera, knowing Sophie would be watching with Rebecca, knowing veterans across the country would be watching, knowing this moment mattered. "As for profit, Senator, I've been offered millions for exclusive interviews, book deals, movie rights. I've turned them all down. Whatever money might legally be mine from that cash, I'm donating it to establish a rehabilitation center for veterans, because the real treasure here isn't gold or bonds or coins. It's integrity. It's accountability. It's knowing that one person with evidence and courage can still make a difference in this country." The hearing room was silent for a long moment. Then Senator Morrison nodded, and Marcus saw something like respect in her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Webb. Let's proceed with the investigation." The hearing lasted 6 hours. Marcus answered every question, provided every detail, maintained his composure even when senators hostile to his claims tried to rattle him. He was cross-examined about his mental health, his finances, his motivations. He was asked to explain technical details about the documents, about chain of custody, about how he could be certain the evidence was authentic. Through it all, he remained steady. This was his mission now, his new deployment, not fighting in the desert, but fighting for truth in the halls of power. And he wasn't going to fail. When it was finally over, when he stepped out of the hearing room into a scrum of reporters and cameras, Tommy was waiting with a smile. "You did it, brother. You actually did it." "We did it," Marcus corrected. "All of us. None of this happens without the people who believed in me, who protected me, who refused to let the truth stay buried." That night, as Marcus flew back to Nevada, he allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. The fight wasn't over. There would be more hearings, more investigations, more legal battles, but he'd stood in front of the nation and told the truth. He'd looked powerful people in the eye and refused to be silenced. And more importantly, he'd shown Sophie that integrity mattered, that doing the right thing was worth fighting for, that one person could make a difference if they were brave enough to try. The tank that had seemed like his last desperate gamble had become his purpose. The vault that had held Cold War secrets had opened up a future Marcus never could have imagined. He'd bought scrap metal and found redemption. He'd sought survival and discovered meaning. And whatever came next, he knew he'd made the right choice. Because some treasures are worth more than gold, and some fights are worth more than any fortune. The legal battles dragged on for 18 months. 18 months of depositions and motions, and endless paperwork that turned Marcus's small kitchen table into a makeshift war room covered with legal documents and case files. 18 months of lawyers arguing over bearer bonds and gold certificates, and who had legal claim to artifacts from a war that had ended before some of the attorneys were even born. Jake worked tirelessly, often for free when Marcus's limited funds ran dry, building a case that was part property law, part whistleblower protection, part moral argument about what happens when you find evidence of crimes hidden inside something you legally purchased. The government's position was straightforward. The cash was stolen government property that should be returned immediately. The private claimants, whose identities were shielded behind layers of corporate entities and attorney-client privilege, argued that the assets had been legally obtained by their clients, and Marcus had no right to them. Marcus's position, crafted carefully by Jake and a team of pro bono attorneys from a veterans legal aid organization, was more nuanced. He wasn't claiming ownership of everything in the vault. He acknowledged that some of it probably did belong to the government, that some of it might legitimately belong to other parties. But as the legal purchaser of the tank at a government-sanctioned auction, he had rights too. And more importantly, the documents detailing criminal activity weren't anyone's property to claim. They were evidence, and they belonged in the hands of prosecutors and investigators who could use them to pursue justice. The judge assigned to the case was a woman named Helen Rodriguez, a former Marine officer who'd served in the First Gulf War before going to law school. She was in her late 60s now, with steel gray hair and the kind of presence that made lawyers on both sides straighten their spines and choose their words carefully. Marcus liked her immediately, recognized in her the same no-nonsense competence he'd seen in the best officers he'd served under. Judge Rodriguez wasn't interested in legal gymnastics or procedural delays. She wanted facts, evidence, and straight answers. During one particularly contentious hearing where government lawyers were trying to seal portions of the case file under national security claims, she'd cut them off mid-argument. "Counselor," she'd said, her voice sharp enough to cut steel, "I served 20 years in the Marine Corps. I know what legitimate national security concerns look like. And I also know what we don't want to be embarrassed looks like. These documents detail criminal activity from 30 years ago. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. Whatever national security justification you think you have, it expired about the time the Berlin Wall came down. Now sit down and stop wasting this court's time." The ruling, when it finally came down, was a split decision that somehow managed to give everyone something, while satisfying no one completely. The bearer bonds and gold certificates, Judge Rodriguez ruled, were government property that should be returned to the Treasury Department. However, Marcus was entitled to a finder's fee of 15% of their total verified value, in recognition of his legal purchase of the tank and his voluntary disclosure of the contents. The rare coins were a more complicated issue, as many appeared to have been stolen from private collections. Those would be returned to rightful owners where possible, with Marcus receiving fair market value for any that couldn't be traced. But the real victory was in the judge's ruling about the documents. Those, she declared, were not property to be claimed by anyone. They were evidence of crimes, and Marcus had not only the right, but the duty to turn them over to appropriate investigative authorities. Moreover, she granted him full whistleblower protection under federal law, meaning he couldn't be prosecuted or penalized for exposing the information contained in those documents. "Mr. Webb," she'd said from the bench, looking directly at him, "you found these materials through legal means, purchased at a government auction. You came forward with evidence of serious crimes when you could have kept quiet and profited. This court finds that your actions were not only legal, but commendable. Whatever percentage of the financial assets you receive, you've earned through your integrity and courage. I hope you'll use it wisely." The total verified value of the bearer bonds and certificates came to $347 million. 15% of that was just over $52 million. Marcus Webb, the broken veteran who'd been 3 months behind on his trailer park rent, who'd spent his last savings on a tank he planned to cut up for scrap, was suddenly worth more money than he could properly comprehend. He sat in the courtroom when the final accounting was read, his mind unable to fully process the numbers. $52 million. $52 million. It was abstract, surreal, like hearing about someone else's life rather than his own. Tommy, sitting beside him, let out a low whistle. "Brother, you know what this means. You never have to work another day in your life. Sophie can go to any college she wants. You can buy a house, a real house, with a yard and everything. I can build something that matters," Marcus interrupted quietly. "Something that helps people, something that proves." All of this wasn't just about the money. Within a month, Marcus had established the Webb Foundation for Veteran Rehabilitation. He endowed it with $40 million, keeping $12 million for himself, enough to provide security for Sophie's future. To buy that house with a yard, to never have to choose between medication and electricity again. But the bulk of it, the real fortune, went into building something bigger than himself. The foundation's mission was simple: provide comprehensive rehabilitation services for veterans struggling to transition back to civilian life. Not just physical therapy or mental health counseling, though those would be central, but job training, education, assistance, housing support, family counseling, addiction treatment, everything that Marcus had needed and couldn't access when he'd come home broken from Afghanistan. He purchased 80 acres of land outside of Reno, in the high desert where the air was clean and the sky seemed endless. The land had once been a failed resort development, sold for pennies on the dollar after the 2008 crash. It had infrastructure already in place: roads, water, electrical, even some buildings that could be renovated, which meant they could move quickly from vision to reality. Major Sarah Reeves, who'd retired from the military after her superiors tried to bury the investigation, agreed to serve as the foundation's executive director. Tommy became the facilities manager. Dominic's security company got the contract to provide campus safety. Jake joined the board of directors, providing legal oversight. Professor Stone became an advisor, helping develop educational programs. And Marcus, he became something he'd never expected to be: a leader, a visionary, someone other veterans looked to for hope and guidance. The story of the tank, the vault, the congressional testimony, all of it had made Marcus a national figure in veteran advocacy circles. He was invited to speak at VA hospitals, at Veteran Service Organization conferences, at fundraisers for military charities. Some of these invitations he accepted, though public speaking still terrified him and the attention made his anxiety spike. But he showed up, told his story, used his unexpected platform to talk about the struggles veterans faced and the support they needed. And other veterans listened. Not because Marcus was particularly eloquent or charismatic, but because he was real. He didn't pretend to have all the answers. He didn't sugarcoat his own struggles with PTSD, depression, the dark nights when survival felt like the hardest thing he'd ever done. He was honest about his failures, his broken marriage, the times he'd let Sophie down, the years he'd spent barely hanging on. But he was also honest about hope, about the possibility of healing, about the fact that broken things could be repaired if you had the right tools and the right support and the willingness to do the painful work of putting yourself back together. The response was overwhelming. Within weeks of announcing the foundation, Marcus was receiving hundreds of emails and letters from veterans who wanted to be part of what he was building. Some wanted to use the services when they were available. Others wanted to volunteer, to work, to contribute their own skills and experience to help other veterans. One letter in particular stuck with Marcus. It was from a Marine named David Torres who'd lost both legs in Fallujah and had been living in his car for the past 3 months. Unable to hold down a job, unable to afford both rent and the medications that kept his phantom pain manageable. "I saw you on the news," Torres had written in shaky handwriting. "Saw a guy who looked as broken as I feel, talking about building something for people like us. I don't know if what you're doing is real or just another empty promise. But I'm writing this from a parking lot at 3 in the morning, and I figured it couldn't hurt to reach out. If you're serious about helping veterans, I'm serious about being helped. And if I ever get back on my feet, I'm serious about helping others too." Marcus called him that same day. By the end of the week, Torres was living in a small apartment Marcus had rented for him, was connected with medical services at the VA, and had a job lined up on the construction crew that was building out the rehabilitation center. 2 years later, Torres would be the foundation's outreach coordinator, the person responsible for connecting struggling veterans with the services they needed. The construction took 8 months. Marcus was there almost every day, despite his injured leg, despite the pain that still flared up when he pushed himself too hard. He worked alongside the crews when he could, helped make decisions about layout and design, insisted on details that others might have overlooked. The residential buildings needed to be accessible but not institutional, comfortable but not luxurious, places where veterans would feel at home rather than like patients in a facility. The medical clinic needed to be comprehensive but not overwhelming, staffed by people who understood military culture and combat trauma. The vocational training workshops needed real equipment, not hand-me-downs, tools that would prepare veterans for actual careers, rather than just keeping them busy. And at the center of the campus, visible from every building, Marcus wanted the tank, not hidden away, not relegated to some corner, but prominently displayed as both memorial and symbol. The M60 pattern that had changed his life, that had held secrets for decades, that had somehow found its way to him at exactly the moment he'd needed it most. Tommy organized the transport and installation. They brought the tank in on a flatbed truck, positioned it on a raised concrete platform, and secured it so that visitors could walk around it, could see it from every angle, could understand its significance. But Marcus didn't want it to just sit there like a museum piece. He wanted it to tell a story, wanted people to understand what it represented. So he had a bronze plaque mounted on the platform, and he wrote the inscription himself. This M60 Patton tank, purchased for $3,000 at a surplus auction, contained evidence of Cold War corruption that led to congressional investigations and criminal prosecutions. But more than that, it contained possibility. It reminded one broken veteran that hidden things can be found, that truth matters, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. From instruments of war, we build instruments of peace. From secrets buried in steel, we create hope written in stone. This tank once carried weapons. Now it carries a message that from the wreckage of the past, we can construct a better future. Sophie was the first person outside the construction crew to see the finished inscription. Marcus had brought her out to the site on a Saturday afternoon. Her first visit since ground had broken. She was 11 now, taller, her face starting to lose its little girl softness and show hints of the young woman she'd become. She'd been through a lot in the past 2 years, the media attention, the threats, the stress of watching her father navigate something far bigger than either of them had anticipated. But she'd also watched him transform, watched him go from the broken man who could barely make rent to someone who stood up in front of Congress and demanded accountability. Watched him take a fortune that could have solved all his problems and choose instead to use it to help others. Watched him build something meaningful out of something that had been forgotten and abandoned, just like he'd rebuilt himself. She read the plaque twice, then looked up at him with those dark eyes that still saw through every facade he tried to maintain. "Daddy, are you happy now?" It was such a simple question, but it cut right to the heart of everything. Was he happy? Marcus considered it carefully, wanted to give her an honest answer. "I'm not sure happy is the right word," he said slowly. "I still have nightmares. My leg still hurts. I still have days where the depression makes it hard to get out of bed. But I have purpose now, baby. I have something I'm building that matters. Something that'll help people long after I'm gone. And yeah, that feels better than happy. That feels like peace." Sophie hugged him fiercely. "I'm proud of you. I know I said it before, but I mean it even more now. You're not just brave, you're good, and that's harder." The rehabilitation center opened on a warm October morning. 2 years and 3 months after Marcus had first opened the vault in that tank. The ceremony was small, intimate, nothing like the media circus that had surrounded the congressional hearings, just veterans, staff, supporters, and the people who'd made it all possible. Marcus stood at the podium, looking out at the faces gathered before him. He saw Tommy and Jake and Dominic and Patterson, his brothers who'd protected him when he needed it most. He saw Major Sarah Reeves, who'd risked her career to ensure the truth came out. He saw Professor Stone, who'd waited 30 years for vindication and had lived to see it. He saw David Torres and the 50 other veterans who'd already moved into the residential program, who were starting their own journeys from broken to whole. And he saw Sophie, sitting in the front row next to Rebecca. His ex-wife had been cautious about the whole thing at first, worried that Marcus was taking on too much, that the stress would trigger a breakdown, that he'd fail spectacularly and drag Sophie down with him. But gradually, as the foundation took shape and Marcus proved he could handle it, her skepticism had turned to something like respect. "I'm not good at speeches," Marcus began, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "I'm a mechanic. I'm better with wrenches than words. But I'm going to try to explain what this place means and why it matters." He paused, gathering his thoughts. 2 years ago, I was drowning. Medical debt, barely seeing my daughter, working 3 jobs just to stay behind on my bills. I bought that tank behind me thinking I'd cut it up for scrap, maybe make enough money to survive another few months. I had no idea what I was going to find inside it. The money, the bonds, the coins, all of that changed my life in obvious ways. But the real change wasn't about wealth. It was about purpose. It was about realizing that I'd spent 5 years feeling useless, broken, like I didn't matter anymore. And then suddenly, I had evidence that mattered, a story that mattered, a choice to make that actually mattered. He looked directly at the veterans in the front rows. "Every single one of you knows what it's like to come home and feel lost. To feel like the most important part of your life is over. Like you peaked in a uniform, and everything after is just survival. To feel like the country you served has moved on and doesn't have much use for broken warriors. This place exists to tell you that's a lie. You're not broken beyond repair. You're not useless. You're not forgotten. You're veterans who served something bigger than yourselves, and now you deserve support that's worthy of that service. Not charity, not pity, but genuine help from people who understand what you've been through, because they've been through it too." His voice caught slightly. "I can't promise this place will fix everything. I still have bad days. But I can promise that you won't face them alone, that you'll have brothers and sisters who understand, who won't judge, who'll help you carry the weight until you're strong enough to carry it yourself. We're calling this the Webb Foundation. But it's not about me. It's about all of us. It's about proving that from the wreckage of war, from the trauma and pain and loss, we can build something that helps others. We can turn our scars into wisdom, our struggle into strength, our darkness into light, for people who are still trying to find their way." He gestured toward the tank. That machine was built for destruction. Now it stands as a monument to transformation, to the idea that nothing is beyond redemption if we're willing to do the work. You're all here because you're willing to do that work. And I promise you, we're going to do it together. The applause was thunderous, echoing across the desert campus. But what moved Marcus most was the looks on the faces of the veterans in front of him, the way their shoulders straightened slightly, the way something like hope flickered in eyes that had been dark for too long. After the ceremony, as people toured the facilities, and Marcus shook hands and answered questions, an elderly woman approached him. She was in her 80s, Marcus guessed, with white hair and hands that shook with age or emotion or both. "Mr. Webb," she said, "I'm Eleanor Vance. Colonel Harrison Vance was my husband." Marcus froze. Colonel Vance, the man whose name appeared throughout the documents, whose operation had created the cash, whose crimes Marcus had exposed. "I know what my husband did," Eleanor continued, her voice steady despite the obvious pain. "I suspected some of it while he was alive, but I couldn't prove anything, couldn't get him to admit to anything. After he died, I found some papers, enough to know he'd been involved in something wrong, but I didn't know how to make it right, didn't know who to tell or what to do." She took Marcus's hand in both of hers. "Thank you for finding his secrets. Thank you for exposing them. Harrison wasn't a monster, but he did monstrous things, and he never faced consequences. What you did, bringing the truth to light, that's the accountability he should have faced when he was alive. And what you're building here, using the evidence of his crimes to help veterans, that's a kind of redemption he never earned, but that I'm grateful exists." She pressed something into his hand. A photograph, old and faded, showing a young officer in uniform standing beside a tank. Marcus recognized it as the same model he now owned, possibly even the same vehicle. "That's Harrison in 1982, Eleanor said, "before he went wrong, before the corruption and the lies. I want you to have it, to remember that the people who commit crimes are still people, complicated, flawed, capable of both good and evil. Maybe that'll help you understand the veterans you're helping here. Remind you that everyone deserves a chance at redemption." Marcus studied the photograph, seeing in the young officer's face the same determination and sense of purpose he'd felt in his own military service. How did someone go from that to what Vance had become? What choices? What compromises? What rationalizations? "Thank you," he said. "I'll keep this. I'll remember." The impact of the rehabilitation center rippled outward faster than Marcus had anticipated. The media coverage, initially focused on the scandal and the money, gradually shifted to focus on what he was building. News segments featured veterans who'd gone through the program, who were now employed, housed, healing. Documentary filmmakers asked to chronicle the center's first year. Veteran service organizations from around the country reached out, wanting to learn from the model, wanting to replicate it in their own communities. And other veterans, inspired by Marcus's story, started coming forward with their own discoveries. A Marine in California found documents in his grandfather's attic that detailed another illegal weapons operation, this one from the Vietnam era. An Army veteran in Texas discovered a small cache of Cold War assets while renovating a building he'd purchased. A Navy corpsman found evidence of medical experiments on service members that had been covered up for decades. Each discovery led to investigations, prosecutions, accountability. It was like Marcus had opened a door that others had been afraid to approach. By showing that it was possible to stand up to powerful people, to demand truth and accountability, to survive the backlash and come out stronger, he'd given other veterans permission to do the same. The prosecutions resulting from Marcus's evidence took years to wind through the legal system. Some of the defendants were in their 70s and 80s now, had thought they'd escaped accountability for crimes committed decades ago. The trials were complex, requiring expert testimony about Cold War operations, about classified programs, about the legal framework that existed at the time versus the crimes that had been committed. 3 former colonels were convicted of weapons smuggling and conspiracy. 2 defense contractors were found guilty of fraud and corruption. A retired senator who'd facilitated some of the deals was censured by Congress and stripped of his pension. It wasn't complete justice. Some of those involved had died. Others had enough political protection to avoid prosecution. But it was more accountability than Marcus had dared hope for when he first opened that vault. For Marcus personally, the transformation was profound. The nightmares didn't stop completely, but they became less frequent, less intense. The depression that had shadowed him for years didn't disappear, but it loosened its grip, became manageable rather than overwhelming. His injured leg would never be what it was before the explosion, but he learned to work within its limitations rather than raging against them. More importantly, he learned to forgive himself. Forgive himself for not saving his brothers in Afghanistan, for not being the husband Rebecca needed, for not being the father Sophie deserved in those first years after he came home. He couldn't change the past, couldn't undo his mistakes, but he could learn from them, grow beyond them, use them to inform the man he was becoming, rather than let them define who he'd been. He started seeing a therapist again, paid for by his own money rather than inadequate insurance. He joined a support group for veterans with PTSD, where he could talk about the nightmares and the triggers, and the moments when the past felt more real than the present. He started exercising regularly, not to punish his body but to strengthen it, to reclaim some sense of control over the physical form that had betrayed him so catastrophically. And he built a relationship with Sophie that was more honest, more present than anything they'd had before. He couldn't give her back the years when he'd been too broken to be the father she needed, but he could show up now, fully and completely, for every school event and birthday and ordinary Tuesday evening dinner. He could let her see him not as some distant hero or broken victim, but as a real person doing his best, making mistakes, learning, growing. She'd asked him once, a few months after the center opened, if he ever thought about the other path, the one where he'd taken the $50,000 bribe to keep quiet, or where he'd just kept the money from the vault and never reported it. Sometimes, he'd admitted. Usually late at night when I can't sleep and my brain won't stop spinning. I think about how much easier that would have been, how much less stressful, how we could have just disappeared with the money and lived a quiet life somewhere. Would you have been happy? Sophie asked. Marcus considered it. No, I don't think I could have lived with myself, knowing I'd buried evidence of crimes just to make my life easier. Every time I looked at you, every time I spent money from that cash, I'd have thought about the people who got away with betraying their oaths. It would have poisoned everything good about having the money. So, you did the right thing, Sophie said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. I did the thing I could live with, Marcus corrected. Maybe that's what the right thing always is. By the end of the 3rd year, the Webb Foundation had served over 400 veterans. Some stayed for the full 6-month residential program. Others used specific services, the medical clinic, the job training, the counseling while living off campus. The outcomes weren't perfect. Healing never is. But they were significant, measurable, real. Employment rates among program participants exceeded 75%. Substance abuse relapses dropped to less than 15%, compared to national averages over 40%. For veterans with similar challenges, participant surveys showed dramatic improvements in mental health, family relationships, quality of life measures. But the statistics, as impressive as they were, didn't capture the real impact. That lived in individual stories, in transformations that couldn't be quantified. Like Rodriguez, who'd gone from living in his car to becoming the outreach coordinator, who now spent his days connecting struggling veterans with the help they needed, who'd found purpose in service once again. Like Martinez, a former Army sergeant who'd lost her left arm in Iraq and had spent 5 years fighting depression before the foundation helped her get certified as a computer programmer, who now worked remotely and volunteered teaching coding skills to other disabled veterans. Like Chen. Wait. Never use Chen. Like Morrison, a Navy veteran who'd attempted suicide 3 times before enrolling in the program, who was now 2 years sober and working as a peer counselor, using his own struggles to help others find reasons to keep living. Like hundreds of others whose names Marcus knew, whose stories he carried, whose healing proved that the money he'd found had been used for exactly what it should have been: saving lives, rebuilding futures, transforming pain into purpose. The town of Reno, which had been struggling economically for years, found new life in the center's presence. The foundation employed over 100 people directly: counselors, medical staff, facilities crew, administrators, instructors. Local businesses benefited from the veterans who lived there, who shopped and ate and gradually reintegrated into the community. Property values in the area increased. New development followed. Marcus had worried initially that local residents might resent the center, might fear having hundreds of veterans with PTSD and trauma histories moving into their area. But the opposite happened. The community embraced it, recognizing that these were people who'd served their country and deserved support, that the center was bringing jobs and economic activity and a sense of purpose to a region that needed all three. And the tank, that M60 Patton that had started everything, became an unexpected tourist attraction. Visitors came from across the country to see it, to hear the story, to take photographs standing beside the machine that had held such extraordinary secrets. School groups toured the center, learning about Cold War history and veteran issues and the importance of accountability in government. The tank became a teaching tool, a conversation starter, a physical reminder that extraordinary things could hide in plain sight, waiting for someone brave or desperate or lucky enough to find them. 5 years after Marcus bought that tank for $3,000, he stood beside it on a crisp November morning, watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of gold and amber. Sophie was with him, 15 now and taller than him, preparing to apply to colleges, already talking about studying social work or psychology, so she could help people the way her father had. "Do you ever feel like it was fate?" she asked, standing beside him with her hand on the tank's hull. "Like the universe knew you needed to find this, needed to be the one to open that vault?" Marcus smiled. "I'm not sure I believe in fate. I think I was just a desperate guy making a desperate choice, and I got incredibly lucky, or unlucky, depending on how you look at it. If I'd bought literally any other vehicle at that auction, none of this happens. I'd probably still be working 3 part-time jobs and barely scraping by." "But you didn't buy any other vehicle," Sophie pointed out. "You bought this one. You found the vault. You made the choice to come forward instead of keeping quiet. Maybe that's what fate is, not some cosmic plan, but a series of choices that add up to something meaningful." "When did you get so philosophical?" Marcus asked. "I had a good teacher," she replied, squeezing his hand. They stood there in comfortable silence, father and daughter, both of them transformed by the journey that had started with a tank bought for scrap. Marcus thought about all the moments that had led to this one, all the choices and chances and coincidences that had brought him from that dark place 5 years ago to this peaceful morning. He thought about the brothers he'd lost in Afghanistan, wondered what they'd think of what he'd built, hoped they'd be proud that their sacrifice hadn't been meaningless, that he'd taken the survival they'd made possible and created something worthy of it. He thought about the veterans he'd helped, the ones who'd found hope when they'd been ready to give up, the ones who'd discovered that healing was possible even when it seemed impossible. He thought about the corrupt officials who'd been brought to justice, about the accountability that had finally come decades too late, but had come nonetheless, about the message sent that even powerful people couldn't escape consequences forever. And he thought about himself, about the transformation from broken veteran barely surviving to someone who'd built something that would outlast him, who'd proven that redemption wasn't just possible but achievable, that from the wreckage of trauma and pain, you could construct something beautiful and meaningful and lasting. "You know what the best part is," Marcus said to Sophie. "This place will be here long after I'm gone, helping veterans, providing support, proving that people matter more than politics or money or power. That's a legacy worth more than any fortune." "You're not going anywhere for a long time," Sophie said firmly. "I need you around to embarrass me, at my college graduation and wedding, and all the other important life events." Marcus laughed. "I'll do my best." As they walked back toward the main campus, past buildings where veterans were waking up to another day of healing, past the medical clinic where lives were being literally and figuratively saved, past the workshop where new skills were being learned and new futures built, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt since before the explosion that had nearly killed him. He felt whole. Not healed, he'd never be fully healed. The scars ran too deep for that, but whole in a way that transcended physical or mental wellness. He felt like all the broken pieces of himself had been gathered up and reassembled into something that, while imperfect, was functional and purposeful and good. The tank had been his salvation, but not because of the money inside it. It had saved him by giving him a choice, by forcing him to decide what kind of man he wanted to be, by offering him a path from victim to victor, from survivor to thriver, from someone things happened to into someone who made things happen. And every day, he got to watch other veterans walk that same path, make those same choices, discover their own transformations. Every day, he got to be part of something bigger than himself, something that would ripple outward through lives and communities and generations. That, Marcus realized, was the real treasure. Not the gold or the bonds or the coins, but the opportunity to turn suffering into service, trauma into teaching, pain into purpose. Anyone can stumble upon wealth, but it takes real courage to choose truth over treasure, especially when truth demands sacrifice and treasure promises comfort. As the Nevada sun warmed the Foundation campus, Marcus Webb stood watching new arrivals file through the entrance, their faces carrying the same exhaustion and hope he remembered from his own darkest days. This was his legacy now, not the headlines or the congressional testimony that had faded from public memory, but this place where broken warriors came to heal and broken systems were challenged to do better. Because for Marcus and for every veteran who walked through those doors, the real vault had never been hidden in a tank. It was inside them all along, waiting for someone to believe they were worth more than the world had told them. The mechanic who once scraped by on scrap metal had become the architect of second chances, proving that sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones we build, not the ones we find. The sun climbed higher, warming the bronze plaque on the tank. catching the words Marcus had written years ago about turning instruments of war into instruments of peace. He ran his hand along the cool metal one more time. This machine that had carried him from desperation to purpose, from barely surviving to truly living. And in that moment, standing beside the tank that had changed everything, with his daughter at his side, and his life's work spread out before him, Marcus Webb finally understood what it meant to come home from war. Not to a place, but to yourself. Not to who you were before, but to who you could become after. Not to forget what you'd lost, but to honor it by building something worthy of the sacrifice. The tank sat silent and strong, its secrets revealed, its purpose transformed, its legacy secured. And Marcus, the veteran who'd bought it, hoping for scrap metal and found salvation instead, smiled. Because some discoveries change your bank account. But the ones that matter? Those change your soul. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories of courage and redemption are waiting for you. Click to continue the journey. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that even the most broken among us can build something beautiful from the wreckage of the past.